Hello, fifth graders, and welcome to Language Arts for today. You will need your copy of Gilgamesh, perhaps paper and pencil. Again, it kind of depends on how things have been going for you with your questions. First thing we're going to do, as usual, is take a look at our homework questions from the last assignment. And then we'll take a look at today's questions as well. So, number 1 from homework. Why was it so difficult to hold on to Old Man Young? This is our correct option. It was so difficult because it was prickly. 2, what does Gilgamesh hope that the gods will say after they see the deeds that he plans to do? Gilgamesh, number 1, this one here, hopes that the gods will say, shall such a man die? Never, after they see the deeds that he plans to do. 3, what tragic event happened to Gilgamesh at the end of the chapter? It's our last choice here. The tragic event that happened to Gilgamesh at the end of the chapter is that a snake ate Old Man Young before Gilgamesh could. Oops, I'm accidentally taking my own quiz or homework assignment. 4A, in this chapter, Gilgamesh begins thinking of the needs of others. What is one quote that shows that Gilgamesh is thinking about the needs of another person? And we see this same question twice. I essentially asked you to find 2 quotes. So in addition to restating that question, one quote that shows Gilgamesh is thinking about the needs of another person is, you should have provided a quote. There are lots and lots and lots of quotes. Even starting from the beginning of the chapter, he says that he will give Old Man Young to the old men first. He says, I shall give it to the old men of Uruk and see them grow young again before my eyes. That could have been a choice. Moving on to page 86. Urshanabi, what have I done to you? I've robbed you of your livelihood. I've put you out of favor with the gods. Great quotes. Or come home with me, Urshanabi. Come back to Uruk would be another one. The whole bottom, soon we see bottom of 86 on to 87. He says, to think I caused his banishment. He thought of Siduri, the wine seller, for instance. He talks about how he shouldn't have left his people at a time of drought, right? All of these are times, great quotes that show when Gilgamesh has started thinking about the needs of others. And this was really related to that objective and actually to our objective again today. There's some transformation happening in Gilgamesh as he continues on this journey. Number 5, write a vocabulary sentence following those vocab sentence expectations. Compensation. And I've been giving feedback about those vocab sentences as well. Central problem of the story. I told you that I think I mentioned that probably 3 different times in previous videos. So the central problem of the story is that Gilgamesh wants to find everlasting life, eternal life, that Gilgamesh wants to live forever. Any of those options would have been great options. This is an important one to remember, 5th graders. It will help us moving forward as we consider kind of the motivating pieces of the story and as we move towards writing a paragraph and move towards a test. For today, we're going to finish the book today. We're actually reading 2 chapters. So question 1 asks us, how had Gilgamesh's feelings about the lions changed? You'll remember that earlier on he killed the lions simply because he was bothered by how alive they were. Number 2 asks, what did Gilgamesh realize he had rarely done before? The book uses these words in it. You should be looking for the text where it talks about Gilgamesh realizing he had rarely done something. 3, what was the 12th tablet for? 4, what is one way in which Gilgamesh ultimately achieves immortality? So we say one way in which Gilgamesh ultimately achieves immortality is, this does not need to be a quote here, but there are kind of 2 different possible answers to this question for number 4. 5, relating directly to what you'll see as our objective. What is one quote that shows how Gilgamesh has changed? So one quote that shows how Gilgamesh has changed is, and then lastly, we have a vocabulary sentence, which is asking you to use this word frailty, which means weakness. When we say frailty, we say weakness, okay? So as we look at our objective for today, 5th graders, we're again trying to identify a change in Gilgamesh. I stated just a moment ago, right, that we're starting to see that he is becoming a different person. It seems that there's this transformation that's happened for him. Okay, so again, looking for quotes that will show this change in him. Fifth graders, we're going to get into our reading. We're on chapter 11, which is home, on page 88. So go ahead and get your book open, ready to follow along, and we will get into it. Chapter 11, home. Gilgamesh knelt on the bank of the pool, vomiting his misery in great retching sobs. He beat his torn fists on the ground and howled like a wild animal. All gone, Urshanabi. What was it all for? All those weeks, all that suffering and pain. What am I? Nobody. Some sick old man with nothing to show for it but tears. Oh, I wouldn't say, Urshanabi murmured comfort, but Gilgamesh was deaf to anything but his own lament. So Urshanabi kind of gets cut off, but Gilgamesh just says, what am I? I'm a nobody. Nothing, but I've got nothing to show for it but tears. And Urshanabi's about to say, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that you've got nothing to show but your tears. So Urshanabi's kind of reflecting that maybe Gilgamesh has gotten more from this journey than he's thinking, okay? They traveled back through the garden of the gods, gathering up gemstones like so many fallen petals from under the flower bushes. They stumbled back through the Mashu mountain. Somehow, it was not so dark for two. Besides, the darkness inside Gilgamesh was 10 times as black. They traveled back through the gates of Shamash, where the scorpion guards stared at them in astonishment. They traveled back through the mountain pass where the lions had prowled. There seemed to be just as many as before, but now Gilgamesh was startled by their beauty. Their hides suited them better than they had him. He did not want to slaughter them. They would be soon enough dead, bereft of their lithe, elegant beauty. Tell me about Uruk, said Urshanabi, and Gilgamesh found he was eager to do so. The city is one part field, one part town, one part gardens. Then there are the temples, of course, wonders of the world. The water from the river is ducted through the city, threads of silver everywhere like wire in a tapestry. The wall is high and curved. The foundations were laid in the days of the 7 sages. Even when the bull of heaven stamped, those walls stayed standing. Urshanabi listened without interrupting. My builders are the best. My masons take pride in their work, and my gardeners are skilled at grafting and pruning. I wonder you ever left such a place, Urshanabi remarked mildly. So too did Gilgamesh when he saw Uruk. Each familiar roof and tower and window was like the features of a well-loved face. The perfumes of his childhood came to the gate to meet him. At least he had lived to see it all again. As he walked through the streets, people idly looked up at these 2 grubby strangers. A murmur of excitement built up in their wake. Can it be? It can't be. The king, you mean? Never. He's long dead, surely. Come and see. Go and tell the children. Look, look. Gilgamesh the Mighty has come home. Where are the banners? See how white his hair. Where has he been? So as Gilgamesh and Urshanabi are walking through the streets, people are seeing him and thinking, is that him? It can't be him. Look at him. He looks so different. And some remark that they're not really prepared, right? They probably should be welcoming home a king with banners and a celebration. Right now, they're just strolling down the street and people are just observing. An inexpressible tenderness filled Gilgamesh. After being in lonely, distant places, it was good to see so many familiar faces. After the brown of the stony wilderness, the black of the mountain's interior, he wondered at the multicolors of the city. It's interesting. It kind of makes me think about the rainbow, right? And how Utnapishtim is reflecting that perhaps the rainbow is more beautiful because you don't see it all the time. It's short-lived. And now we're seeing he's been in this sort of brown and blackness, and now he's being exposed to multicolors, and that perhaps maybe it's this increased beauty the more that there's this is something unique that he hasn't seen before. He had forgotten how many flowers there were, how the awnings and drying washing added to the gold of the masonry, the red of the terracotta. He had forgotten all the noises, too. Women singing, dogs barking, chickens cackling, donkeys braying, the vendors shouting their wares. Only the sound of building had fallen quiet, with no one to order new towers or temples. So the only sound that's not there is people building, and that's because Gilgamesh isn't there to order them to do it. A woman's voice drifted from a window. So as we hear this woman speaking, we're going to infer a little bit, but presumably someone told her, "Did you hear? Gilgamesh is back." And her voice drifts from the window. "Worst news I've heard. Must we go back now to war and work?" She came to her window and looked out, straight into the face of the king. So she's talking badly about Gilgamesh, right? It's the worst news I've ever heard that he's back. This is horrible. And she comes out to realize that he's right there listening to what she's saying. Her eyes, already fearful, widened into terror as she realized he had heard her. She feared for her life. So she's kind of thinking about what she remembers about Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh before probably would have killed someone who was talking badly to him like that. And so now she's got this terror. Gilgamesh returned her a smile, an awkward, grimacing smile, realizing how rarely he had ever smiled before. So Gilgamesh is so ill practiced at smiling that it's kind of like an awkward, like. At his shoulder, the ferryman stood, gazing about him. "Well, Urshanabi, didn't I say it was the finest city in the world?" Urshanabi smiled and nodded. At last, Gilgamesh's tour of the city brought them to the carved friezes depicting the deeds of past heroes. There was Utnapishtim, his odd cube-shaped ark wedged on a mountaintop. There were the 7 sages. And there was Enkidu and Gilgamesh bringing home the tallest tree from the cedar forest to build new gates for Uruk. "And this, I take it, is Enkidu," said the ferryman. Gilgamesh had left Uruk before the scene was carved. At first, he could not bear to look. Then he could not stop looking. His hand reached out towards the figure carved high up, far larger than life in bas relief. His fingers came to rest on the ankle of Enkidu. "I came back, friend, just as I was. But I came back." Urshanabi saw his eyes were full of tears. The ferryman smiled and shook his head. Nothing could be further from the truth. So we see this reflection, right? Gilgamesh tells him, "I came back just as I was, but I came back." He's talking to this image of Enkidu, which you can sort of see, right, carved on the sides of these papers is this idea. It's an artist's imagining of what that must look like. So what is Gilgamesh saying when he says, "I came back just as I was"? Gilgamesh was having this reflection. So what Gilgamesh is probably telling him is, "I left to find eternal life, and I came back and I don't have it. So I came back just the same as I left." But then Urshanabi smiles to himself and shakes his head and thinks nothing could be further from the truth. So why does he say that, do you think? Why is he saying nothing is further than the truth? Gilgamesh says, "I came back just as I was." And Urshanabi's reflecting, no, that couldn't be further than the truth. So this reflection, I think that Urshanabi's having, and probably what he was trying to explain to Gilgamesh before, is you think that nothing's different, that you're coming back with nothing to show for it. But really, you're coming back with a whole new outlook on life. You're coming back with new, better qualities, right? We see that he's starting to change, and that's what Urshanabi is shaking his head about, saying, no, you're not coming back just like you left. You're coming back a totally different person. All right, we're going to go right into chapter 12. The skies over Uruk, this is the 12th tablet. The skies over Uruk were smoky as the king's sacrifices burned. Meat and fruit, oil and flowers. The gods were drawn like flies to circle in the perfumed air. This has been mentioned earlier in the book, the gods circling the smells of a sacrifice. After fulfilling his duty to the gods, Gilgamesh sent for his masons. The people groaned. Now the building would begin again. Soon it would be the wars. But Gilgamesh was too weary for battle campaigns. Since destroying the steering gear of the ferry boat, he thought twice about destroying things. Fearing death, he no longer wished it on the young men of his city. Exhausted, he no longer wanted anyone to work themselves into an early grave. He did not want anyone to mourn as he had mourned for Enkidu. He looked at the old men and felt responsible for their frailty. So that paragraph has a lot of quotes that would really go with this idea. But he did send for his masons and scribes. He told them to carve his adventures on the wall of heroes and write them on clay tablets for future generations to read. While he told them his story, they listened like children at his feet, open mouthed, fingers in their hair, astounded. They ran home and told their wives and children, and soon the city buzzed with voices retelling the epic of Gilgamesh. What a story it was! The king's dreams reenacted his adventures. Sometimes he woke crying, sometimes screaming, and sometimes he even woke up laughing. Through his window, he heard people say, "He has changed. How he has changed." But how could that be? This is Gilgamesh thinking. He had not gained immortality. He had not eaten the prickly plant. Surely it was they who had changed. Once they hated him, and now, for some reason, they loved him. So we, as readers, are supposed to be thoughtful about this, right? He's hearing everyone say that he's changed. But in his mind, he's thinking, I haven't changed. I'm not immortal. I'm not younger. So he thinks, it can't be me. It's got to be them that's different. And it says, for some reason, they loved him now. And again, Gilgamesh is having a tough time understanding that the reason they love him now is because he's become kinder, more just, more temperate, right? He's expressing more, showing more virtue. And this is bringing them to love him. So Gilgamesh still kind of thinks he's exactly the same and hasn't quite noticed the change in himself. When the frieze was finished, he went to look at it. But tell me, why this empty panel at the end? Do you think I will be going on more journeys? Asked Gilgamesh wryly. No, sire, but begging your pardon, sire, that panel is to show your funeral. Gilgamesh rocked as if he had been struck. He returned to the palace and asked to see what his scribe poets had written. They brought him 11 tablets. I suppose you realize this is incomplete, he said, his voice harsh and rasping. You have not recounted my death. The scribes bowed low. Naturally, there will be a 12th tablet, my lord king. So even this, right? Gilgamesh was so fixated this whole story on finding how to live forever. And now he seems to be asking them, you know you're going to have to take stock of my death, right? You're going to have to write about that, okay? At last, Gilgamesh took to heart the advice of Siduri the wine seller. He did marry, and he did have children. On the day his first son was born, he took the child in his arms and stood on the broad sill of his room, overlooking an Uruk golden in the evening sun. Tears ran down his cheeks now as freely as the day his friend had died. But today he was crying tears of joy. For was he not holding new life in his arms? And did it not have his eyes and his hands and his long feet and his Sumerian nose? Was he not as immortal now as every other father of sons? The child's hand within his own was as small as the seed of a cedar tree. He called the child Prince Enkidu. Out of the darkness of sleep, a dream hurtled down, a meteor trailing a tail of light, and an axe lying in the street. The meteor was fame, the axe his fate. They were heavy to carry, but no one else would have even tried to pick them up. As it was, Gilgamesh did such things, dared so much, learned such wisdom, conquered such fear, that his name outlived the gods themselves. Which is true, right? Here we are talking about this person well after his life. Long after Enlil and Anu, Ishtar, Ea, and Shamash had been forgotten on the plain of two rivers, the fame of Gilgamesh lived on. He was Gilgamesh the mortal, Gilgamesh the friend, Gilgamesh the father, Gilgamesh the hero, Gilgamesh the coward, Gilgamesh the wise man, Gilgamesh the fool. Everyone wants to leave their mark on the world, and he left a mark as big as a meteor crashing to earth. As they carved on the 12th tablet, he walked through darkness, and so glimpsed the light. The end, fifth graders. So, a couple of things to note, right? We see these tablets here. Do you see that picture of these? This would be like the 12 tablets, okay, on which they carved about Gilgamesh's journey. But you may have noticed, and maybe not, it's also the table of contents, the same pictures. But even more, every picture matches a picture from the start of the chapter. So as you look, you can actually find these images throughout the story. I'm trying to find other ones of that show, and these match the pictures, right? So each different part, and it matches parts of his adventures. These are the 12 tablets that are capturing his life, and he's being remembered. So it's interesting. Gilgamesh arguably achieves this sort of immortality, right? Not in the way that he thinks, but also kind of in the way that he thinks. I mean, he doesn't live forever, literally, but he's lived forever in other ways. He talks about leaving his mark on the world, and he's done that. And he also has this reflection of how immortality kind of comes to all humans who choose it, right? For children, right? And so, and even that, right? He honors Enkidu by naming his son Enkidu. So, fifth graders, got some questions, some reflections. And again, this idea of like Gilgamesh changing, Gilgamesh being different, perhaps, than he was before. So go ahead and do those questions. When we come back in the future, we're going to be doing some activities that are going to have us reflecting on and writing about and showing some thoughts about Gilgamesh moving forward. Okay, good luck, and let me know if you have questions.